All right, stand by. 10 seconds.
camera,
to
one.
go.
Talent. Ready, camera, two.
And cue talent.
2,
One.
1, roll for record.
President Obama won't shut the heck up about global warming, literally. I'm John Phillips, and this is The Rundown. He was allotted 3 minutes to give a few remarks to around 150 world leaders gathered at the Paris Climate Change Conference, but he just kept talking and talking and talking. In fact, I think he's still going right now. Ignoring the wrap-it-up beep that just keeps echoing through the auditorium, the beepers eventually gave up, and he just kept going. It sounded like Jimmy Kimmel's unnecessary swearing, just beep, beep, beep. After all, he invented global warming, or was that Al Gore? But the dirty truth is that the whole thing is a sham. Here's the deal. Even if we set aside all the scientific argument, and even if we assume that global warming is real, is caused by human activity, and can be stopped, this agreement won't do a darn thing about it. Developing nations like India or China are expected to produce the vast majority of air pollution over the next century. But this agreement doesn't ask them to cut anything. All they have to do is say how much carbon emissions they intend to produce decades from now, and then claim they'll produce less than that amount. Is there a system to check whether they're meeting that arbitrary standard? No way. Are there any consequences for nations that break the deal? Nope. What do they get for making these vague, unenforceable promises? A ton of cash from you and me, and primarily Steven Cruiser. That's right. The pollution standards may be vague, but the payouts aren't. They're in cold, hard cash. The first world is expected to mitigate our collective guilt by paying poorer countries huge amounts for past carbon sins against the planet. But according to a recent survey, Americans are growing less concerned about climate change rather than more, in spite of decades of unprecedented fear-mongering and propagandizing by government, the news media, the educational system, and of course Hollywood. The Washington Post, ABC News poll found that only 47% of Americans think the government should do more about climate change. And that's not a majority, although still a healthy number, but it's down from 61% back in 2008. Another recent poll conducted by Fox News asked Americans to name the biggest problem facing the country. Get this, only 3% pick climate change. Is the president so desperate for a green legacy that he's buying a worthless document from developing nations in exchange for huge amounts of our money? Is the whole issue of global warming the winner Democrats seem to think it is? Or do we have much bigger problems to deal with? To explore these questions and much, much more, we're joined from Dallas, Texas by PJTV contributor and author Scott Ott, and here in sunny Southern California, stand-up comic and PJTV contributor Steven Cruiser. You know, Cruiser, it's interesting that this conference happened in Paris, which is where the terrorist attack occurred not that long ago. That's a real threat. That's a clear and present threat that the entire world is facing. Not just the Western world, but the third world too. A lot of people get killed in developing countries. That is a problem that's facing all of us. Climate change is something that they think is facing all of us, but it might be something that happens in the future, even in their terms, in terms that they describe it. Is it as appalling to you that we have a real threat facing us and then we have an imaginary threat facing us and they choose to deal with the imaginary threat, not the real one?
It's not just appalling, it's frightening. I mean, this is like, you know, life and death stuff you're talking about here, and they're acting like the stuff that's not life and death is life and death. I mean, the president had to spend the first part of the time he got to Paris justifying the fact that he was there because everybody knows it's a sham. And that number with only the 3% identified as the largest problem is stunning because it's in such sharp contrast to all of the three Democratic candidates right now keep saying that climate change is the biggest threat facing us. After Paris, too. They all went out and gave little foreign policy speeches, but they're still going with that. They're not addressing terrorism in their ads. They're not addressing terrorism on the campaign trail that much. They're all still saying that climate change is the biggest threat facing us, and the electorate is saying the polar opposite.
Will there be political consequences, Scott Ott, for this decision? Will there be consequences for Democrats who have identified a problem that the American public is not on board with as the biggest threat facing humanity as they head into another presidential election?
I think there will be consequences if Democrats fail to address other issues that really are relevant to people. I mean, I think I could see a pathway to the presidency for a Democratic candidate who talked about climate change and this world agreement and all that kind of stuff, but who put her focus, I'm sorry, did I say her? Who put her focus on the economy and on protecting our national security. And so I don't think that this is a killer. It's not a deal breaker for people, but it is an utter waste. As you pointed out, I mean, even if climate change is happening, is caused by man, there's literally nothing we can do about it. There's this whole idea that we can somehow restrain the temperature growth from going up 2 degrees Celsius. There is no known way to make that happen. And even if it could, the 2-degree number isn't something that appeared in the IPCC global warming report. It's something that was come up with by politicians. The whole purpose of this is to transfer money from wealthy producing nations to the poor nations, who, by the way, have been the greatest beneficiaries of the capitalist surge due to the production of fossil fuels anywhere in the world. They've come out of desperate poverty in many cases and become manufacturing, burgeoning countries that are benefiting from the medicines and from the income that comes because of us.
And food production as well. Now, Scott, you're a guy who's into history.
Yes.
You read a lot about history. You write a lot about history. If you go back into post-war America, the government decided that we needed to write a huge check to Europe. We needed to help rebuild. We needed to send Marshall money around the world to make the world function. And the American public got behind it because the government sold it in a way that was palatable to the masses. Right now, if the government were to come to us and say, we need to do a Marshall Plan for the third world, we have too much, as you said, we have too much wealth, there's too much inequality in the globe, we need a Marshall Plan for the third world, let's just send them huge checks. The public would reject it. They wouldn't accept that on any possible level. Is this a backdoor way of sending Marshall money to the third world in a way that they think they can sell?
Well, the Marshall Plan worked because we restored the industrial infrastructure of Germany and Japan primarily. I mean, the Marshall Plan worked because of oil. That is the crux of it. The reason why it worked was because those countries then became great industrial powers, despite, in the case of Japan, a real paucity of natural resources on that little rocky island. And so, no, I don't think that that can work, because the Marshall Plan's purpose wasn't just to hand over money to people and say, hey, here, we're going to take care of you. It was to build up their own capacity to take care of themselves. Now we're saying, oh, we've got some sort of Marshall Plan that's going to go for solar and wind energy, but both of those resources are nowhere near being profitable, even in the countries like the United States, where we know how to do it right.
You know, Cruiser, you look at the legacy of Democrats like FDR. He built bridges. He built dams. He built an infrastructure that we still use today. Democrats were big into that. Here in Pat Brown, he built the water system. He built the university system. He built the freeway system. That is his legacy. For whatever reason, Democrats just all woke up one day and they collectively decided they were going to stop building things, and this was going to be the legacy. Is this what this debate is really about, the legacy of President Obama and other Democrats?
I know it's the legacy that he most wants. It's the one he's been pursuing the most relentlessly since he got into office. It's the one I'm sure he's getting the most special interest money from. I was recently listening to an NPR in-depth discussion about this, and they were talking about a couple things that both of you have alluded to that were kind of like caught me off guard. One is Scott was mentioning there's nothing you can do to reverse any of that. That's what they were talking about. They were saying that this conference is purportedly there to try to figure out how to reverse the effects of climate change, and they kept talking about that. And I went, really? Is that what you're going to do with this? But mostly what it's about, they said it's the countries and special interest groups. They mentioned that specifically, and not without any shame whatsoever. And they said that they're hammering out this agreement, but the sticking point is going to be 60 countries demanding that the West adequately fund them going forward. That's what it's really about. It is just this big wealth redistribution scam, and it's not building something, but it's something that this president is so desperately focused on, because after a while, we've joked about it for years, but He's a socialist and he wants to bring it to the world. That's what he's doing. He'd like to teach the world to redistribute.
Well, is it that,
John?
or is this China eating our lunch, Scott, which is the bigger threat to me? I mean, I don't want to send a check to the third world and have a big, massive wealth redistribution. But I mean, if you want to talk about what could bring about the end of the world, to me, it is China in an unchecked world. If we turn around and we allow the Chinese to do whatever it is that they want to do, and we put handcuffs on ourselves, that's not good news for the future of this country, is it, Scott?
No, and as the president's primary role is as commander-in-chief of the military, and his primary responsibility is the safety and security of the United States and the protection of her national interests. And what he has essentially done is abdicated that to countries like China, who have plans, as you pointed out, that say in the future they actually set goals that where they're going to be allowed to produce more carbon than they would have if they didn't make any changes to what they were doing right now. So the agreement actually allows China to be a greater polluter, a greater producer of so-called global warming. No, in effect, this entire agreement, and what they're bragging about is, you know what, it may not have a great impact, but we got 130 countries to agree to something, and there's something to be said for that. Yes, what 130 countries, or 129 of them, agreed to is that America needs to be taken down a peg and needs to pump more money to the rest of the world. And President Obama is bragging about the fact that he has brought America down.
All right, I want both of you to look in your crystal balls and tell me 100 years from now, which country strategically poses the biggest threat to the United States?
100 years from
100
now?
years from now.
It's still going to be China. They've got the population, they've got the hybrid capitalism, communism thing going on, I think, and they're just going to get bigger and stronger, and they're malevolent, which we don't talk about much. It's not like they're all just sitting back hoping we'll become business partners. They are ambitious, and they have the kind of grand ambitions that the old Soviet Union had.
Scott, 100 years from now, who's the biggest threat?
The biggest threat 100 years from now will be the same as it is right now. The country that is most likely to take down the United States of America is located in a 10-square-mile district, kind of near Virginia and Maryland. We call it Washington, D.C. That's the greatest threat. Abraham Lincoln was right. We're not going to be destroyed from without. We're going to be destroyed from within if that's to happen.
All right, Scott, you get the last word. That's all the time we have for today. But now it's your turn. Is the issue of global warming a political winner for the Democrats, or is the American people, they're fed up with decades of hysteria? Tell us what you think in the comments section below. I'm John Phillips. Thanks so much for watching The Rundown.